I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons, and eventually I did turn to cannibalism.
Jeffrey Dahmer reacting to life sentence. That was Jeffrey Dahmer a few days before he was given the highest level of punishment, a life sentence, reserved for the most notorious criminals. 17 lives were taken away by this man who seemed to personify pure evil. The details were beyond terrifying as investigators unveiled boxes with evidence of unimaginable cruelty. This is the story of the Milwaukee cannibal's reaction after he was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. A Trial of Monster. February 17, 1992, a day of reckoning for one of the most notorious criminals in modern-day history. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for the chilling murders and dismemberment of 15 young men and boys. His arrest 6 months earlier had shocked the nation. When authorities uncovered his gruesome collection of body parts and evidence of necrophilia and cannibalism, it was a story that traumatized the world. The Wisconsin courts were unprepared to face such monstrous evil. Jeffrey Dahmer stood in the courtroom at his sentencing, surprisingly calm and even relieved. However, his words were quite shocking as he pleaded guilty in court. This left one terrifying question for the courtroom to decide. Was this monster insane, or was he fully aware of the horror he inflicted? As the trial unfolded, the jury sat through 2 agonizing weeks of testimony detailing unimaginable acts of murder, mutilation, and perverse obsession. On January 30th, the court began the difficult task of confronting evil in its rawest form. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours before reaching their verdict. Dahmer was sane, fully conscious of his crimes, and undeniably guilty. Although Dahmer claimed he didn't act out of hate, he was diagnosed with paraphilia, substance use disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Dahmer insisted that his story might serve as a warning to others with similar dark compulsions. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz pointed to Dahmer's reliance on alcohol to commit his crimes. The horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes was beyond anything most could comprehend. Fortunately, the judicial system rose to the occasion. In the face of unimaginable horror, it managed to process the case with an almost miraculous balance of compassion and efficiency. 6 months later, the trial concluded, but unfortunately, Dahmer's trial took place in Wisconsin, a state without the death penalty. Standing before the court, Dahmer pledged that any money from his case should go to his victims' families. So eventually, the relics of his crimes, hatchets, saws, and even the refrigerator where he kept body parts were auctioned off. The murderer extended his apologies not only to the victims' families, but also to those who tried to intervene. For the families of the victims, this verdict brought little peace in an otherwise dark story. But can there truly be healing when faced with such a dark reality? The victims' families. Dahmer's violent spree had roots in an earlier crime. In 1989, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a 13-year-old boy, Somsak Sinthansamphone, after luring him to his apartment with promises of money for nude photos. The judge initially intended to sentence him to 8 years, but reduced it after receiving a letter of regret from Dahmer. As a result, he only served 10 months in prison before being granted freedom that would cost lives. Dahmer later apologized to police officers whose careers were ruined after they failed to stop him. In May 1991, 2 officers encountered Konrak Sinthansamphone, a 14-year-old boy, Somsak's younger brother, who was drunk, bruised, and wandering the streets. Despite neighbors' protests, the officers returned the boy to Dahmer, who claimed he was his boyfriend. Hours later, Dahmer murdered him. The Milwaukee Journal broke the story 2 months later with the damning headline, "Police were in the apartment." They had unknowingly stood on the edge of the charnel house filled with body parts. Emotionless and calm, Dahmer's apology for this tragedy was as close as he ever came to showing regret. In his early court appearances, Jeffrey Dahmer was quite indifferent. His face was a perfect, unreadable poker face. As the investigation unfolded, more victims were uncovered and more charges piled up against him. Yet Dahmer's dark expression never changed, leaving the media and the public disturbed. It wasn't until the final trial that the voices of the victims' families were heard after they confronted the man who had destroyed their lives. One after the other, the families of the 15 men and boys Dahmer murdered stepped forward, finally able to look him in the eye. In 1991, Tony Hughes, a vibrant young black man, crossed paths with Dahmer in a meeting that would tragically cost him his life. Dahmer lured Tony from a bus stop to his apartment under the guise of friendship. Once inside, Dahmer took Tony's life, storing his body in a freezer before eventually dismembering it. Dahmer later confessed to the crime, admitting that he was drawn to Tony's appearance and wanted to maintain a physical connection with his lifeless body. Tony's murder was one of many that earned Dahmer the famous title of the Milwaukee Cannibal. During the court trial, Tony's mother, Shirley Hughes, carried the unbearable weight of her son's loss. She described Tony as a friendly, outgoing soul who loved meeting people and lending a helping hand. After Dahmer's arrest, Shirley spoke out, rejecting any narrative that painted him as mentally ill or out of control.
My name is Shirley Hughes, and I'm Tony Anthony Hughes' mother. First of all, thank God, and to give thanks to the judge and to Mr. McCann for the verdict that came in.
Shirley urged the world not to sympathize with the man who had destroyed her family, claiming that he deserved the full weight of justice. In a victim impact statement, Shirley addressed Dahmer after asking him, "Why am I a victim in your cruel and ruthless world?" Her words described the pain of Dorothy Strader, another grieving mother. Dorothy's son, Curtis Darrell Strader, was a bright and ambitious 17-year-old with dreams of modeling and college. Curtis lived with his grandmother after losing his job as a nursing assistant. On February 18, 1991, he was waiting at a bus stop near Marquette University when Dahmer approached, offering money in exchange for posing for photos. Curtis accepted and never returned home. Dahmer killed Curtis in his apartment, adding yet another name to his list of victims. At Dahmer's trial, Dorothy Strader delivered a heartbreaking statement.
You took my 17-year-old son away from me. You took my daughter's only brother away from her. You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you. You almost destroyed me, but I refuse to let you destroy me. I will carry on.
Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old black man and Dahmer's 11th victim, met his end in April 1991. Lindsay had gone to a Milwaukee mall to have a new key cut when Dahmer lured him to his apartment with the promise of cash. There, Lindsay was drugged, and in a gory experiment, Dahmer drilled a hole in his skull, attempting to create a compliant, zombie-like state. When Lindsay woke up, confused and in pain, Dahmer sedated him again before ultimately taking his life and dismembering him. At Dahmer's trial, Lindsay's sister, Rita Isbell, delivered an emotional victim impact statement. Her raw emotional outburst, captured on video, showed the depth of her family's agony. Screaming directly at Dahmer, Isbell cried out for her brother. Her voice is filled with pain and rage due to Dahmer's lawyer describing his actions as being out of control. She wanted Dahmer to understand the destruction he had caused, pain beyond measure. Other families shared similar grief. Richard Guerrero, one of Dahmer's early victims, disappeared in 1988. At just 25 years old, Guerrero was a beloved brother and uncle. His sister, Janie Hagan, recalled his close bond with their mother and his love for babysitting her young daughter. When Guerrero went missing, the police dismissed the family's concerns, showing little urgency, which Hagan attributed to her brother's Hispanic background. Desperate for answers, the family hired a private investigator only to be defrauded. Guerrero's disappearance left wounds that never healed. When news broke of Dahmer's gruesome acts, families like Hagen's were traumatized again. Efforts to commercialize Dahmer's crimes, such as walking tours retracing his steps, only increased their pain. Hagen condemned those ventures as gruesome entertainment, after saying, "This whole thing opens up a lot of old wounds, a lot of painful memories. It's that same hurt all over again."
That Jeffrey, you are el diablo, el puro diablo que estaba suelto en las calles de nosotros. That means the devil, the pure devil that walked our streets and was loose. So, Your Honor, please, I beg you, don't let this man ever walk our streets or see daylight again.
However, in Jeffrey's dark story, one survivor stood out: Tracy Edwards. He was the sole man to escape Dahmer's clutches and lived to tell the tale. Tracy's escape on July 22, 1991, ultimately led to Dahmer's apartment, uncovering the unimaginable horrors within and putting an end to his killing spree. In 1991, Tracy Edwards became one of the few to survive the horrors of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, a house of unimaginable terror. Edwards, a 32-year-old man, accepted Dahmer's invitation to his apartment, lured by an offer to watch The Exorcist and share a few beers. The evening turned into a nightmare when Dahmer handcuffed Edwards and threatened him with a knife. Desperate to escape, Edwards broke free and ran into the streets of Milwaukee, the handcuffs still dangling from his wrist. Police found Edwards wandering in shock and followed him back to Dahmer's apartment, where they discovered Polaroid photographs of mutilated victims and human body parts scattered throughout the apartment. Edwards' courage to escape and alert authorities led to Dahmer's arrest and the eventual uncovering of his gruesome crimes. Later on, Edwards testified during Dahmer's trial in 1992, recounting his terrifying experience. Though Edwards helped bring Dahmer to justice, his lawyer described the long-lasting impact on his mental health. Struggling with post-traumatic stress, Edwards turned to drugs and alcohol, drifting aimlessly and unable to confront the memories of his near-death experience. The sentence. After 3 long and agonizing weeks, Jeffrey Dahmer's trial finally came to an end. Throughout the proceedings, chilling testimonies from police officers and psychiatrists painted a terrifying portrait of the man responsible for one of the most horrific killing sprees in modern history. They described a man whose sickening urges to possess the dead drove him to drug, murder, and mutilate his victims, turning his twisted fantasies into a nightmarish reality. His actions were calculated, each one a brutal step toward fulfilling his grotesque desires. But despite the horror Dahmer had inflicted, Wisconsin's legal team did not offer the death penalty. Instead, Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison, a life that would stretch far beyond any reasonable human expectation. The judge's final words echoed through the courtroom as he imposed the mandatory life sentence, 15 consecutive life terms, 1 for each of his victims, along with an additional 10 years for his habitual criminality. The total was a massive 957 years behind bars. This sentence, though technically allowing for the possibility of parole, meant that Dahmer would never again walk free. Even if he were granted parole on one of his life sentences, the others would automatically take effect, making him ineligible for release for the next 936 years. The judge remarked that Dahmer would not be eligible for release until the year 2949, a dark reality for a man whose crimes had irrevocably stained the world. Yet the question remains, how different might Dahmer's fate have been if he faced the death penalty? At first, it seems unlikely he would have pleaded guilty under such a grave circumstance. Dahmer himself had once openly expressed a desire to die, telling the court he wanted death for himself, but his defense attorneys would have done everything in their power to prevent him from choosing that irreversible fate. Ethically bound to protect their client, they would have likely delayed any guilty plea, shielding him from the possibility of execution. They might have even argued that Dahmer was unfit to plead, anything to delay the inevitable, whether it meant keeping him alive for the trials ahead or finding a way to evade the death sentence. Even his cooperation with law enforcement, as he confessed in chilling detail to the police, could have been a problem for his defense. His lawyers, fully aware of the stakes, would have fought tooth and nail to prevent him from speaking. They would have pushed to silence him, knowing that his detailed confessions only sealed his fate more tightly and exposed the full extent of his monstrous acts. In the end, in Wisconsin, where the death penalty was not an option, the inevitable happened. Dahmer would never taste freedom again. Yet his fate would take a turn in an entirely unexpected direction. Just 2 years into his sentence at Columbia Correctional Institution, Dahmer's life came to a brutal end. In November of 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, a fittingly violent and merciless conclusion to a life defined by horror and cruelty. The news of his death sent shockwaves across the country, with mixed reactions from the families of his victims. For some, there was a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that Dahmer had met a violent end. But for others, the sense of justice was never fully realized. There could never be a happy ending to the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. His death was the tragic, violent closing of a chapter already soaked in unimaginable darkness. The world would never forget the horrors he committed, and in his life, in the end, ended with the same brutality he had inflicted on so many innocent souls.